as I mentioned, what I'm talking about is this concept of co-innovation, and I'll start with a bit of what is co-innovation, and for that I'll talk about the broad concept of co-innovation and then dive into one of the examples that we undertook as part of this program of looking at the concept of co-innovation, so you can dig into the detail of what it can look like. And in that case, it was in working with an irrigation scheme around water use efficiency. And then the second part of my presentation breaks out co-innovation into a set of 5 principles, and under those, the practices, some of the practices you can use to implement those principles. And I'm hoping in the process of that, there might be some ideas, some fresh ideas for your communities of practice. And then, always got to be honest about this, nothing ever seems to work out exactly as you'd hoped. Perhaps my previous webinar would be an example of that. So I'll also talk about some of the challenges we experienced as well. Now, the way I've sort of structured things is, after I've talked about what is co-innovation, open it up for questions for you, and then also at the end, and I'll finish up with a few sort of links and suggestions for more information if you're interested. So, I'd like to start with a question for you. Keen to hear from those of you who are on around, have you heard about co-innovation before? So if you can just type in the chat box a yes if you have, or a no if you haven't. And this will just help me get a feel for the level of familiarity. So we've got, looks like a couple of yeses and a couple of nos. Okay then. So for some of this will be new territory, and for others we'll be covering some familiar ground. So it'll be great to see what questions pop up as well from you. As we go, please feel free to put questions in, and then I'll stop at a point where you can put in more questions, or also we can answer them. So what is co-innovation? So very broadly, it's the idea of moving from what would be a traditional sort of linear approach, where science would come up with new ideas, turn them into technologies, and they would be passed on to farmers via extension. And that approach, has served us very well in New Zealand agriculture. It's increased our production and productivity massively. But more recently, we've started to get into more complex problems like improving water use efficiency in irrigation schemes, reducing the loss of nutrients into waterways, managing for many new insect pests in horticulture. And that led us to a co-innovation approach, which moves from a linear to more of a networked approach. And what that looks like, I'll describe in the context of one of the case studies that we looked at in this primary innovation program. So in total in that program, we looked at 4, which are in these grey boxes, past examples of projects and the extent to which they brought in co-innovation concepts. And then we also had these 5 live projects that were working in real time and implementing and adapting a co-innovation approach. And we hypothesized that the different problems they were working on ranged from ones that were relatively simple and so could use more of a technology transfer approach. So for example, improving the target weights of dairy heifers before they go back onto the dairy platform, through to more complex and contested problems like dairy farm nutrient management and irrigation scheme water use efficiency. And so I hope through these examples, you'll see some connections with the topics that you're working with your communities of practice on as well. So if I dive into this irrigation scheme water use efficiency one a little bit and talk about how they went about co-innovating. So this project started out with a focus on improving on-farm irrigation decisions in the Waimakariri irrigation scheme in a way that would help them to make more efficient use of the water that they have allocated to the scheme. So for that project, there was a scientist, Ms. Srinivasan, who's a researcher, a hydrologist from NIWA, which is another one of our government-funded research organisations. And he had the idea of, if we can characterise irrigation demand and provide farmers with very location-specific, detailed forecasts of rain and also water supply, that will help those farmers to make more informed decisions. So if it's going to rain and they've got good data on that, maybe they can hold off irrigating. Now, when you think about this challenge of water use efficiency with a co-innovation perspective, then that solution that MS Srinivasan was coming up with of providing that accurate weather forecast data as part of a jigsaw that you're trying to bring together to improve the water use efficiency on that and on those farms and in the irrigation scheme. So that forecast data alone isn't going to be enough to improve that water efficiency. The farmers in the scheme need to be able to identify opportunities to manage their water use and realise profits from improved water reliability. So by having improved water reliability, could they make changes to the crops they're growing or when they're finishing stock, those sorts of things. And for that, those farmers might work with extension agents, farm advisors to help them identify what those opportunities might be and how to implement them on their farms. Then within the irrigation scheme itself, they would have infrastructure for storing and supplying water, which would help the farmers to be able to, if they don't need the water at that time, store it for a later time. Also within the irrigation scheme, there are the rules that they use for allocating water. So when the project started, the irrigation scheme allocated water 48 hours in advance. Farmers had their turn, and then they would wait their turn for their next allocation. The other piece of the puzzle here is also around the irrigation equipment. So being able to implement equipment on the farms that is more efficient about allocating water to account for differences in terms of soil moisture and drainage on the farms. There might be training and technology through an industry body called Irrigation New Zealand that helps to provide farmers with new expertise around better use of their irrigation equipment. And then there's also the rules that are set to allocate the overall amount of water to the irrigation scheme that influences how those farmers use water. And then finally, during the project, the Regional Council, which is responsible for setting regulations around environmental management in the region that the scheme was in, started to bring in rules around reducing the loss of nutrients to waterways. And so that again influenced how farmers would be making use of the information to improve water use efficiency. So the idea then of co-innovation is that traditionally, MS Srinivasan as a scientist might have come up with this idea, worked to develop a technology, and then an extension agent would pass it to the farmer. With a co-innovation approach, it was recognizing that to make that technology work, it needed to fit and make use of potentially changes in irrigation scheme rules, the technologies that are supplied to farmers from irrigators, the policy from the Regional Council called ECAN, and also the advice and support that comes from rural professionals or extension agents or advisors. So that's that networked approach, bringing all of those pieces together. So how did they do that in this project? So for this particular project, they had 5 farms in the irrigation scheme. And those farms were working directly with the researcher, and he was providing them with farm-specific data in real time. And then the important step was at the end of the irrigation season each year, they would hold an annual forum where they would bring together those 5 farmers, plus the other farmers in the irrigation scheme, and critically also the irrigation scheme managers, other researchers, and also other stakeholders, including people from the Regional Council. And in that annual forum, they would share what was happening on those 5 farms, how the farmers were making use of the data, and then open it up to what questions does that raise? Are there things that could be done to help the farmers make better use of the information that was being provided around weather forecasting? The outcome from that was that from original definition of the problem that the scientists had come up with, which was, the problem is that farmers need better weather forecasting data, that was redefined to also include providing information around drainage. And that was critical to the farmers to understand how much water they were losing through the soil profile, but also with these new regulations coming from the Regional Council, what were the nutrients that were going through the profile. So the scientist, the MS, switched what he was providing from not just information on irrigation demand, but also information on drainage. The scheme manager recognised that for the farmers to be able to make the best use of the weather forecasting data, he needed to reduce the time for water requests from 48 to 9 hours. That 48 hours was just too long. Then for the farmers themselves, they shifted from focusing on their water use during the shoulders of the irrigation season to also making more informed decisions around use of irrigation during the peak of the season. And that led to significant reductions in their water use, but also in the drainage that they were experiencing. And that was really pleasing for them because they're making better use of water, had more water available, and then also meant that they were reducing their nutrient loss. Beyond the project, there were 25 farmers who were using data for scheduling. And then there was also another irrigation scheme that started to look at testing the technologies in their own scheme. And a critical piece of the puzzle that I alluded to was that farmers realised the importance of being able to store water, which they hadn't been able to do previously. So farmers started sharing water storage. Those farmers that had ponds would store water for other farmers that didn't need their allocation at the time it was allotted to them, and then they could use it at another time. So that was a nice example of that sort of network of farmers, scientists, and the scheme manager coming up with a combined solution. So that's a whirlwind tour of co-innovation and an example of it. Open it up to questions at this stage.
Thank you, James. So if anyone has any questions, yeah, type them in the chat box or feel free to unmute yourself. Any questions from anybody at this stage?
And we've got a couple of minutes before others might come on and join.
James, just while people are thinking about things, are your projects ongoing? What's the life of the innovation approach?
Yeah, good question. So if I go back to that list of projects, the ones that were ongoing, the irrigation scheme water use efficiency one is continuing, and that's being funded through a new project, and it's helped it to expand beyond the Waimaka area irrigation scheme. The dairy farm nutrient management one is one that's just finishing up this year. So a lot of the life, to be honest, is dictated by funding. So they may not necessarily have got to the end of implementing all the solutions, but the funding may be the thing that ends them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there is some commitment to see this sort of initiative continue on, which is good to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing is there's been a number of people involved in the project that have gone on to apply a co-innovation approach in other projects that they're working on, which is really good.
Yeah, the irrigation, this one from Tim, yes.
Yes, how big are those irrigation schemes? How many irrigators? Oh, I was going to have to claim that, put the disclaimer that I'm not an expert on irrigation. So I don't know. But what I can do, Tim, is send an email through to MS, the scientist, if you like, and get him to send through an answer to that, rather than me having a guess.
Okay, thanks, James.
Other questions? Yep.
Any other questions at this stage? Okay, well, as they pop up, please add them to the chat box. It is 11:15, James, so we'll let you continue on.
Okay, then. Great, so the next part is around digging into a bit more detail around what can co-innovation look like in practice. And on this slide, what I'm showing is the 5 principles that we sort of distilled out of those 5 ongoing case studies of co-innovation, the sort of key elements, if you like, that were associated with co-innovation being successful. And what I'll do is I'll go through each of these, explain a little bit more about each of the 5 principles, and also give some examples of how we went about implementing those principles in practice. And again, I'm hoping this might, spark some ideas for the communities of practice that you're working with. So the first one which is intuitively obvious when you talk about innovation being moving from linear to networked, is that you need to involve partners and stakeholders. So we're moving beyond the scientist and perhaps the extension agent to also including farmers and growers, potentially government members, even non-government organisations. And the reason for doing this is that when you bring those other partners and stakeholders in, they can really help to understand the problem better. And that example from the irrigation scheme was a nice one, where MS thought he had the problem identified, as about providing weather forecast data, and realised that actually there were other elements to the problem when he'd interacted with the farmers. And also, these other partners are critical for developing the solutions. Again, from the irrigation scheme example, what the scientist was providing was a small piece of a larger puzzle that required regional government, regional council, farmers, extension agents to provide those other parts of the puzzle. To make that work, you need to build relationships based on respect. So absolutely critical is recognizing that each of those partners and stakeholders are experts themselves and bring knowledge and expertise that's a critical part of developing the solutions. So moving away from the idea that the scientist is the expert. They're one of the experts. So some of the ways that we've gone about implementing this principle, you saw from that example from the irrigation scheme, we had forums for dialogue, those workshops, annual workshops. Another project used focus groups, especially early on. That was a heifer rearing one, where they had focus groups with dairy farmers and graziers to get a better understanding of what were the issues that were influencing the achievement of target weights for heifers going back onto dairy platforms. Advisory groups are helpful, especially when you want to bring together people from government, from industry, from research. And then there's a specific tool that we've been using within AgResearch that was developed by Jeff Coots, the Synergy Matrix, or as we call it in AgResearch, the Impact Planning Tool. And that helps to lay out who's doing what from research, from extension, from industry, from government in the process of developing up a solution. So that helps to clarify those roles. And that's been one of the experiences is when you bring more people together, it does increase the risk that people will be unclear about their roles or even abdicate roles thinking that, oh, others will do that. The example of involving partners and stakeholders I've got here is from work on integrated pest management in apples. Where bringing that partners and stakeholders together was undertaken by the industry body, Pipfruit New Zealand at the time. And so they were the ones that brought together the different orchardists, but also the exporters of apples, the pack houses. They also connected with supermarkets in the European Union and brought in researchers as well to be able to provide all of those pieces of the puzzle of developing integrated pest management, which in this case was about producing apples that were pest-free and also were low in insecticide residues. So helping the industry to move from calendar spraying to the integrated pest management. The next principle is to take a problem focus. This is probably for many of you, again, quite intuitive. Within research, though, there's a tendency to leap to the solution, and you saw a little bit of that in the irrigation scheme example where the scientist had identified, yep, the solution is providing weather forecast data. We find this principle is helpful to just get a project to step back for a little bit, especially at the start, and spend some time to understand what is the problem, and especially from a systemic view. So for the dairy heifer grazing example, initially there was a sense that the problem is about providing farmers with very clear guidelines around feeding heifers. But when they did their focus groups and brought in the views of dairy farmers and graziers and took more of a systemic view, they started to identify other things that were influencing the target weights. And a lot of it was around the relationship between the graziers and the dairy farmers and how they came to joint agreement around targets and how they would be met. Taking a problem focus, and especially a systemic view, is helped by bringing multiple disciplines in. So in the heifer grazing example, there were animal nutritionists, but there were also agronomists and also social scientists as well. And then you've got to be willing to adapt your understanding. So if that scientist in the water use efficiency hadn't been willing to go and change his focus from weather forecasting data to also soil moisture monitoring, then they might have been stuck on the same solution. So tips for taking a problem focus comes back to that first principle, involving partners and stakeholders, especially in things like developing a program logic, understanding what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve, what are the outputs that we need to be able to achieve those, or things like causal trees or problem trees that help to take an overarching problem and break it down into some underlying problems. Another thing that I mentioned from the dairy heifer grazing is using stakeholder focus groups. It can provide a lot of really useful insights about the nature of the problem. The third principle is assemble and nurture the right team. So this recognizes that when you move from that linear to a networked approach, there's another set of skills that are needed in your team. You need the technical skills. You also need those people with what you might call soft skills that can help to bring the different stakeholders and partners together, can facilitate that interaction. Sometimes there'll be negotiation involved because there's competing interests, and also bring in systems thinking, helping people to think beyond their particular discipline to the wider system. So it's the complementary technical skills and knowledge along with those soft skills. And those skills are often ones that many extension agents can help to bring to these types of projects, along with the technical skills that they have. Another critical part of the team is having leadership that's focused on collaboration and openness and respect. We found that that was a really critical part of the success of the co-innovation approach, was the qualities of those leaders of the projects. A few tips on how we did this. Extension agents are really critical members of the team because they tend to be integrators. They can sort of see connections between different technical areas, and they're also great translators, being able to shift between the language of scientists and the language of farmers and growers. So they help with that interaction. And also critical are trained facilitators. So again, extension agents tend to have these skills, but it's people who can help to design a series of workshops and processes that ensure that all the stakeholders and partners are able to participate equally. In the Primary Innovation Project, we introduced the concept of a role called reflexive monitoring. And that's just a sort of fancy term for those facilitators or process coaches. And their role was to actually assist the teams by especially working closely with the project leader to implement and reflect on these 5 principles of co-innovation. So how are we doing against these principles? And if it's not working, what can we do to ensure that we're not missing a principle? So for example, might pick up that we haven't really understood the problem correctly. We need to go back to make sure we've done that. The 4th principle is front up early and often. And again, this is a little bit driven by what tends in the past have happened in research projects and research-driven projects where scientists won't interact with stakeholders and partners or users until the very end, until something's technically correct. Whereas each of these projects, like for example the irrigation scheme one, there's quite regular interaction between the science and the different stakeholders as well. And that's important around disseminating information early. So, you know, even early on, different stakeholders may see an opportunity to implement results. And for them, you know, the 80-20 rule applies. Good enough to give it a go and see what happens. And there's a lot that can be learned from implementing something early on. You also understand what the results mean for different stakeholders. So that's critical. So for example, in the irrigation scheme example, the results for the irrigation scheme manager highlighted the need to reduce the time for getting requests for water. For the farmers, it was about how they manage the water. For the scientists, it was around the importance of providing information around soil moisture. And it also throws up new research questions potentially. So to do this, stakeholder workshops are really helpful. And again, designing those in a way where there's plenty of dialogue and discussion around what the results might mean. And also getting systematic feedback from meetings and extension events to understand how the project is going. Is the information they're providing useful? And if it's not, what might need to be changed? So I gave you that example in the water use efficiency project where they had those annual forums, and how in those annual forums they identified different parts of the solution beyond what was coming from the research, and also changed the nature of the problem that was being worked on. The final principle that wraps around those 4 other principles is the action learning cycle: plan, do, observe, reflect. And that's really important because critical to co-innovation is focusing on action. So it's about implementing things and learning from the implementation of those, especially on farm or in an orchard or in a crop. And then also the observe and reflect is critical to then adapting and changing based on what you've learnt by implementing a practice, but also checking what's changing outside of the project. So the irrigation scheme example was a good example of that, where during the course of that project, there was a change, an emerging change in the regulations around nutrient management that were critical for the project to respond to, and also helped the farmers to realise additional value from being able to improve their water use efficiency by also reducing nutrient loss through the soil profile and into waterways. Tips on this one: for all of the projects that we had, we implemented monitoring and evaluation, and really monitoring, evaluation and learning. So they all developed program logics. They were all measuring key performance indicators, and at least once a year coming back to check how they were performing against those and adapt what they were doing. That member of the team, the reflexive monitor, can also help with this by helping the team to run that process of plan, do, observe, reflect to make sure they're going through the cycle. So as I mentioned, it's nice to think that doing these sorts of things like co-innovation will be without challenges, but invariably there'll be little sort of sticking points that pop up along the way. And so what I've got here is some of the challenges that we experienced for each of the principles. I won't go through all of them. I'll just talk to parts of them. So lessons we learned with involving partners and stakeholders was that in one of the projects, it was already quite a way down the way, the heifer rearing project, and starting to involve more partners and stakeholders partway through really didn't work. Those who were already involved started to go, well, why are these people involved? They started to bring their own agendas in. So much better to plan that involvement right from the outset of a project. We also found in another project, this was around crop pests for potato crops, that if you don't have the support of the project leader to involve partners and stakeholders, it's really not going to happen. And in that case, it was that the project was more focused on science. And so the project leader, being in that case, didn't see the need for partners and stakeholders to be directly involved. When you're taking a problem focus, one of the challenges we found there was that for some people it's the fuzzy front end, and from the outside it may look like the project's spinning its wheels. You know, where's the solution? You haven't given us the widget, you haven't delivered us the solution yet. So for that, we really found you had to get buy-in from the project funder and explain the importance of that fuzzy front end, the importance of taking the time to really understand the problem properly, so that you don't end up developing a solution for the wrong problem. In the heifer rearing project, we also found that quite a number of the stakeholders came with predefined agendas and very strong positions, which sort of steered the project to problems that weren't necessarily the ones that the farmers or growers were experiencing. And they're having those focus groups with the graziers and the dairy farmers really helped to bring their agenda into the project rather than the agendas of other stakeholders that were, taking strong positions related to their organisation. Assembling the right team and experience there that I alluded to before was that when you start to bring more people into a project, it becomes a little bit easier to abdicate responsibility. And that's what we found in one of the projects was that really they said, oh, the reflexive monitor, this process coach, they're responsible for co-innovation and we'll carry on doing what we've always been doing. So you need to very early on, again, have strong project leadership that indicates this is, we're working in a new way and the expectation is that we're going to work towards these principles. Front up early and often. I again alluded to this, that the big challenge we experience here is that researchers have a tendency to be reluctant to share early. And a lot of that's driven about concerns that what they're developing isn't technically feasible, isn't proven technically, and that researchers tend to have a higher standard of what that is, probably working to the 100-0 rule rather than the 80-20 rule that others might be working to. And then finally on the plan, do, observe, reflect side of things, we found that sometimes projects wouldn't build in time for a reflection. They would just sort of skip through that and just keep on trucking and not actually check in, are we heading in the right direction? For others, that period of reflection can seem too slow. One of the projects there for rearing one, we had somebody who was really action orientated, and for them this was slowing things down. But it was interesting, partway through the project, as they saw how that time for reflection helped to identify more accurately what the nature of the problem was, they became a real advocate for actually building in a bit of time for reflection. And then also, it's not enough to reflect, but you need to then change what you're doing based on what you've observed and reflected. So we had one project, this potato crop one, where it was very milestone driven. The milestones were written down at the start of the project, and that's what was going to be delivered to. So they didn't look to adapt based on what they were learning as they went, and that meant they missed some opportunities based on what was changing around the project. So that's again a whirlwind sort of tour of co-innovation and the principles and practices. I'd be keen to hear from you. First question is around how, if at all, is co-innovation different from what you're currently doing? So any sort of like quick points in the chat box would be great.
So as you're working with your communities of practice or you're initiating them, what are your thoughts around that? Is co-innovation different from what we're engaged with about communities of practice? Either unmute or, yeah, pop something in the chat box.
Well, people are jotting down ideas. Nice to see that there's a lovely concept, need to get the rest on board. That I'll just take a sort of sideline because that's related to the challenges. That also really helps is when you have an organisation that is supportive of the approach. So, for example, with the heifer rearing project, Dairy New Zealand was very supportive of the approach, and so very explicitly built in that there would be 6 months of the fuzzy front end. Rather than saying we need a project plan designed from the outset, they said, look, we'll give you 6 months, and from that we want the project plan developed. So that having that support from an organisation really does help. Another observation while people are typing points in was that when I presented some of this at the APN conference, I think one of the observations was quite a number of the elements are similar to how many extension agents work, that perhaps the difference was that co-innovation tended to involve more a greater variety of stakeholders.
So Tim is with the Irrigating Agriculture Community Practice, and he's saying, like Nico, who's with the Automatic Milking Community Practice, that they like the idea and concept, but it's different.
Yep. Okay then. And I think we'll touch on a little bit. Again, be interested to hear what challenges you guys have experienced with your communities of practice, and are there similarities or differences with the challenges we experience with co-innovation?
So just pop those challenges into the chat box if you could, the things that are particularly difficult as we go about setting up or running communities of practice. Someone like Johan has been doing it for several years now with the variety of community practices, and Nico and Tim are starting out, and Jessica.
Yes, I see that Tim's pointed out that it does seem a bit different to other projects. Good to have involvement in a project that takes this approach. Yeah, that's a very good point. That that was a neat thing about this primary innovation program, was that we had set up these 5 projects to implement co-innovation in practice, and 2 times a year we would bring the leaders and key participants in each of those co-innovation projects, those cases, together to share their experiences and learning, which I think is fits with how you're working in your communities of practice as well. You're learning from each of you about how you implement communities of practice. Okay, I might go on to the next slide, which is just now putting questions out to you. Have you got any questions for me?
Again, feel free to unmute if it's easier than typing away in the chat box. Johan has put a good comment in there, James, getting people to understand that the outputs will be flexible based on what the CIP determine the needs of the end user to be, which can evolve and change. You don't have explicitly set numbers or deliverables from the outset. So it's fluid and evolving.
Yeah, and that can be a challenge for funders because they will often want, you know, we're going to have so many extension events, we're going to have so many reports delivered at the end to show that the money's been well spent. So a couple of things that we learnt in this project that helped to give those funders confidence and meet their accountability needs was that, one, we used monitoring and evaluation to demonstrate how the projects were progressing towards outcomes. So we were measuring outcomes and progress towards outcomes, not just deliverables. And then also for the program, the overall Primary Innovation Program, we would have a representative from the funder attending a lot of the workshops that we ran, both in the case studies but also in the overall project, so they could see in real time what was happening in the project, and that helped them to also understand why we might be changing direction on something. Hope that helps.
Yeah, no, great, James. Any other key questions from people before we wind up? James, just while perhaps just to close as well, but as people might be thinking of questions, where's your work going now? Like personally, I know you and I have chatted, but the things that you're involved with, the different projects, so people can get a sense of where they might connect with you going forward.
Sure. So I'll finish up with this slide here where you can find out more. So the main initiative that's continuing is that now that the funding for the Primary Innovation Program is finished, there's still work going on within AgResearch around how we implement these concept of co-innovation within our research organisation, and that's through this Beyond Results. So on that Beyond Results website, there's a lot of resources, tools, guides as well. So for example, this guide called Building Co-Innovation into Your Research Proposal. that might be able to provide some insights and ideas. So that's still continuing, and we're still on the journey of bringing co-innovation into AgResearch. Then there's the Primary Innovation website, which is within the Beyond Results website, where we've got descriptions of each of the case studies, and also a lot of the case study project leaders did webinars, which were supported through John James. And so we have a YouTube channel with those on there, so you can sort of hear directly from those project leaders. And that might be then also an opportunity to connect with those project leaders if you want to follow up any more with them. And then for those who are into the researchy type stuff, there's also a project page on ResearchGate, which has more on the research papers from the project. And those research papers range from ones that are very social science about the process of co-innovation, through to ones that are more for project specific. So for example, MS has written a number of really good papers from the perspective of a hydrologist, talking about this process and talking about what has happened in the irrigation scheme. So that's one that I might connect with Tim in terms of answering his question around the size of the irrigation scheme. Does that answer your question, Evan?
Yeah, that's spot on. Thank you very much. And perhaps just the work that you've done in Peru, outline what you're doing there.
Sure. So this is a Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade funded project to work with smallholder dairy farmers in the Peruvian Altiplano, the Sierra. So they will have 2, 3, maybe 4 cows. And we're working with them to identify opportunities to increase their milk production from the dairy cows, because for those farmers, milk production is a critical cash flow through the year. They'll have crops like quinoa or potatoes, which will give them a cash flow, a hit of income, but dairy provides them with a cash flow through the year. And we're sort of supporting them with pasture-based production, because there's been quite a push of American housed systems into the Sierra, which, while they increase milk production, also increase the costs, because the farmers need to pay for housing, animal housing, and for supplements and feed. My role in that project is supporting to get research and extension in Peru more focused on the needs of those small farmers, through things like the co-innovation approach, also training in participatory research methods, and on the extension side, training around farmer-to-farmer extension. There in Peru, the emphasis has tended to be very much on extension agents as being technical experts who tell the farmers, and researchers tend to focus on what's the research that will get published, and they're not well connected to the needs of those smallholder farmers. Is that the sort of stuff you were thinking of, Gavin?
Yeah, no, and I think it's a great example of, I know it's not purely focused on the co-innovation model as such, but it is using the principles and in a challenging situation, or where there's different cultures and different needs. Yeah,
and that's points are a great point, that and why we've worked with principles of co-innovation is that the practice will be adapted for different circumstances. So even each of the projects within Primary Innovation implemented those principles in different ways based on the mix of skills within the team, the nature of the problem, that sort of thing. The principles are transferable. The practice then needs to be adapted. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you, James. If there's no other questions, we might draw things to a close. This recording will be available, and please use it with your fellow members or colleagues or any other stakeholders for that matter. And James's contact details, will circulate those. James has been fantastic to liaise with and deal with over this webinar, and we've been in touch over other things, and there's some good synergies between extensionAUS and the work that James is involved with.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Kevin, for the opportunity, and thank you everybody for your participation. And yeah, I'd love to hear more about what you're doing with your communities of practice. as well.
We'll stay in touch. Thank you, James. I'll close off the webinar now and wish everyone a Merry Christmas. Thank you all.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, James.
Bye.
Bye.